दोस्त दोस्त ना रहा, प्यार प्यार ना रहा, जिंदगी हमें तेरा एतबार ना रहा, एतबार ना रहा.
After the genocide of the first peoples or early indigenous peoples, the Spanish in the Caribbean needed a new source of labor and turned to Africa in the 16th century. Many of us would know about the horrors of African slavery and the slave trade in the Caribbean colonies. For almost 4 centuries, millions of men, women, and children from Africa were transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. Europeans, including the Dutch, British, Spanish, Portuguese, Jews, and the French, were involved in this cruel slave trade as Africans were shipped to the Caribbean colonies to work on the sugar estates. Even when African slavery and apprenticeship had ended in 1838 in the British West Indian colonies, the dreaded slavery system continued in other parts of the Caribbean, Brazil, and the United States. As the ex-slaves departed from the sugar plantations, there were crippling labor shortages and planters desperately needed workers. Soon, approval was sought and obtained from Britain for imported labor to save the sugar industry from collapse. As a result, hundreds of German, French, Chinese immigrants, and also Portuguese, Syrians, the Lebanese, were shipped into the Caribbean. However, the workers in these labor experiments could not cope with the difficult working conditions. Also, many died due to a lack of immunity from tropical diseases. Eventually, these immigrants hurriedly left the dreaded estates and some became small shopkeepers. They developed market gardens and became retail traders. During the 1840s, the planters again faced a labor shortage and made another request to the colonial authorities in Britain, who turned to India. Thousands of Indians from small towns and villages, from areas such as Bihar, the central provinces, Orissa, and Uttar Pradesh were encouraged, tricked, and forced to make the trip to a land of wealth and ease. Their trip to the depot in India was the first leg of the cursed indentureship scheme. Men were the main targets, but women and children were also included. Unfortunately, many of these women were abused in the recruitment process, and these incidents were not reported and thus are absent from the historical records. These men and women were treated with contempt and handled roughly by officials who were unable to correctly spell their names on the ship's registers. But it wasn't only the Caribbean that received these immigrants. More than 1 million of these indentured Indian laborers were taken to work in slave-like conditions in the British Empire's colonies, including Natal, Mauritius, Fiji, Suriname, the British Honduras, which is today known as Belize, and British Guyana, which is today known as Guyana. Additionally, Indian labor was being exported to Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Malaysia, and Ceylon, which is today known as Sri Lanka. They would work on the sugar, cotton, and tea plantations. It cannot be denied that the trade and exploitation by the British East India Company in East and Southeast Asia and India since the 1600s to the 19th century contributed to the economic foundations of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and indirectly contributed to the development of the rest of Europe. The journey from India to the Caribbean meant crossing the Kalapani. Whilst on the trip, an overwhelming majority of the female passengers endured abuse. Caste restrictions were ignored. It was a long trip filled with tears, blood, sweat, hopelessness, and despair. But these brave persons were able to overcome these difficulties, and they and their children were able to make remarkable successes and accomplishments. On these ships, these Indians from different castes, occupations, and villages established a friendship. They were speaking a mixture of languages and dialects such as Bhojpuri, Hindi, and Urdu. Many had a unique manner of dress and physical appearance which was different from those persons living in the Caribbean. It is the evening of the 30th of May, 1845. A ship with the name Fath al-Razak has docked in Port of Spain. Those on board have tired faces, expressionless. Their eyes are fearful, cautious. Their minds are frightened. Yet, these eyes are bold and hopeful. These eyes show mental courage, strength, and determination. And during 1845 and 1917, approximately 147,900 Indians were brought into Trinidad under the indentureship system. From 1866, the Indians entering Trinidad were not immediately sent to plantations. They were processed and registered on Nelson Island. The extremely sick ones were sent to the colonial hospital in Port of Spain, and those who remained on Nelson Island were the majority of Indians who were transported on small boats to Port of Spain and then sent to the plantations. These illiterate and semi-literate Indians are forced to sign contracts in which their names are misspelled. It would be a continuation of their exploitation and suffering. Many would remain with fragmented identities. Some of these immigrants had a Jahaji bundle, and in the bundle, these humble persons brought from India seeds and various spices. Some of them managed to bring copies of their holy books, the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita. These despised working-class Indians struggle in their insanitary habitat. They have the ability to survive the darkest of challenges, and they live in dirty, overcrowded barracks or mud huts. Throughout the British colonies, there are no proper medical facilities. There are mosquitoes, flies, and few latrines. No wonder many of these Indians are ill with anemia, malaria, and hookworm. There's a lack of clean drinking water, and diseases such as cholera, yaws, leprosy, and typhoid are often rampant among the Indians. Many Indians suffer from malnutrition, but these Indians are ignored by the planters and the colonial authorities. Of course, there was no electricity, and in the night they often used flambeaux. At the end of a hard day's work, they would pray, tell stories, sing religious songs, and prepare the meals. During the day, some of the women would wash the clothes by the river and leave them on the rocks and the grass to dry. This was their daily life. There was some reconstituting of their culture and religion. There was some assimilation, some acculturation, And despite the challenges these Indians faced, they were able to become a successful, thriving community. Both men and women, and often their children, worked on the coffee, the cocoa, and the coconut estates, and also the rice fields. Their deplorable working and living conditions, coupled with low wages, were reasons for acts of resistance on the plantations. Such protests included riots, setting fire to the plantations, working slow, and all these acts of resistance contributed to the undermining of indentureship. This resistance amongst the working class included the Jose Massacre of 1884 in South Trinidad, and even the building of a temple in the sea in Waterloo in central Trinidad. It was a bold defiance by unarmed Indians, but these were not isolated incidents. Their actions, coupled with petitions and the movement by anti-indenture activists such as Mohandas Gandhi in India, served to undermine colonialism and imperialism. At the end of their contract, Indians were offered a return passage to India or a parcel of land. The majority accepted the land even though it was located in inhospitable areas. Some Indians decided to take their hard-earned savings and return to India. And some Indians decided to re-indenture themselves with a new contract and continue working on the plantation. After indentureship ended in 1920, the Indians in the Caribbean and other British colonies survived with simple, frugal lifestyle. Some were fishermen, shoemakers, craftsmen, some tended poultry, they reared cows, some had kitchen gardens in which they would grow rice and bhaji and other vegetables. These semi-literate and illiterate Indians knew and appreciated the value of education. Some assisted in the building of primary schools for their children. Others would later use savings to educate sons and daughters, to ensure they are sent to universities abroad so that they could bring dignity to their family and their country. The Presbyterian missionaries from Nova Scotia in Canada, who arrived in Trinidad from 1868, played a crucial role in the assimilation process and social mobility of many Indians and other citizens in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, Guyana, Grenada, St. Lucia, and Jamaica. Their primary schools, known initially as Canadian Mission Indian Schools and later Canadian Mission Schools, were built among the sugar estates, the villages, and the rural areas. These institutions played a very important role in educating the children of the indentured laborers. Interestingly, in the post-World War II era, an educated Indian class was emerging. The needs of the estate residents served as that catalyst for social and economic improvement. Those Indians who left the estates decided to open small businesses and they sold dry goods. Muslims also played an important role, and their mosques or places of worship were built across the Caribbean. Interestingly, since indentureship, the Hindus, Muslims, and Christians in the Caribbean and elsewhere in former British colonies have tended to live in relative harmony. And this high level of tolerance is a remarkable feature of the Caribbean region that must be acknowledged and appreciated. The songs and music are also part of the Indian identity. There are songs associated with festivals and life events. The landscape also shows the Indian presence. Their temples, mosques, jandis, their celebrations and festivals such as Eid, Diwali, Ramlila, and Pagwa. All these reflect the historical ties with India and the cultural persistence. In the late 20th century and early decades of the 21st century, the Indo-Caribbean has been successful in all spheres of life. The Indian diaspora reflects a large-scale migratory pattern which includes a blending of cultures. The Caribbean is home for many Indians, and the ancestral home India will never be forgotten. In the 21st century, there have been considerable discussions and demands for reparations for the descendants of Africans who were enslaved. But we must never, never forget the millions of native peoples in the New World. And we must never forget the Indian diaspora who suffered at the hands of the Europeans. They too must not be forgotten when reparations are being distributed.
झूम झूम धरती